This may not surprise some of you, but the U.S. Forest Service, once again, has introduced language into a national grasslands assessment. This is for the Comanche National Grasslands that threatens the use of grazing animals to manage that grassland in the future. Grassland skies require large ungulates and ruminants in order to thrive. The ecosystems evolved with these types of animals on them. Anyway, so let's get into the Comanche National Grasslands assessment. The assessment actually lists grazing as threatening, right alongside urbanization and industrial purposes. They list grazing as threatening to the grasslands. Now, I realize that this is just bureaucratic wording. Okay, they're putting it in there to say that they have assessed the threats of grazing on the grasslands, and they feel it needs to be done a certain way. There are certain types of grazing that I guess could be threatening. There are certain types of management practices that could be threatening. But when grazing is done properly, it actually maintains that ecosystem. That ecosystem cannot thrive without grazing. So it's not really a threat. It is a keystone process of maintaining that land. But when they put this phrasing in there, what always ends up happening is that years down the road, conservationist groups come in and they start arguing, hey, you said that this was a threat, so we need to cut back or halt it altogether. And this has happened time and time and time again. Point Reyes in California is one that has gotten a lot of attention this year. A lot of people have been talking about Point Reyes. A lot of that has to do with just the craziness that's been going on with the state of California in general. If you read an article by American on One recently, she talked about how the state of California has invested over $10 million of the state's money into rehabilitating Point Reyes, which is a national forest or national park. The argument by conservationists was back in the 1960s when the federal government came in to buy out this land, they intended to remove grazing animals. That's actually not even what's going to happen. Rumor has it that they're actually going to hire private companies to come in and privately graze Point Reyes in order to continue to maintain it, because it's grasslands that has to be grazed in order to be maintained. So now the taxpayers are going to be flipping the bill towards these private entities that are coming in to graze it. Whereas before you had ranchers that were out there who are private entities who were paying to put their animals on that land through leases, and then they were therefore managing it according to how the National Park Service wanted it managed, because it is national park land. The National Park Service bought that land in order to have better control over grazing, in order to preserve its historical and cultural significance, which includes grazing. But conservation groups twisted that wording, and they went in and they sued the federal government for allowing these ranchers to stay there, because after their initial 25-year lease term, they were able to renew, and this went on for about 60 years. But the entire intent when Congress approved buying out that land was not to kick the ranchers off, but to maintain it. Conservation groups actually sued numerous times, and it put the Park Service into a situation where they kept making things harder and harder and harder for these ranchers to operate. In fact, the ranchers who did not take the buyout last year in January, they've made it so difficult for them to actually operate their business that it's not economical for them to stay there anymore. It's basically, hey, we're going to give you the boot one way or the other. We're just going to make it impossible for you to ranch. Those that took the buyout were pretty much pressured into it, and then their lips were sealed. They weren't allowed to talk about it. Anyway, that is a story that has gotten the headlines, but there are other stories where this is happening as well. Everybody is calling for a much colder, stormier winter. What does that mean for you? Well, it means that there could be possible power outages and some very long, dark days, because as you know, the days are only getting shorter from here on out. Yanasa Trading Co. has finally launched its bee yard collection. We currently have natural beeswax candles for sale on Yanasa Trading Co. These candles last about 10 hours each. They're clean burning. Unlike paraffin candles that put toxins into the air, beeswax candles actually help neutralize the air. We only use beeswax candles in our household because we care about our health, we care about our children's health, and we like the smell of warm honey in the dead of winter. Check out Yanasa Trading Co. and order your beeswax candles today. Back in February of 2025, ranchers in Utah sued National Forest Service over cutbacks in grazing in Fish Lake National Forest. These cutbacks happened after conservation groups basically went in using the old assessments of the National Forest and sued the Forest Service for not following their own rules. Cut out the ranchers, cut out the grazing. You know, a lot of these assessments and these EISs, when the Park Service puts them out, they're based on old databases. So when they're talking about species of concern, sometimes those species aren't there anymore. Sometimes those species are no longer of concern because they've repopulated properly, but they don't have access to that information. They don't have boots on the ground. You would think the United States government could put boots on the ground to really understand this stuff, but they don't. A lot of this stuff is based on old databases, old data that is fed to them by conservation groups in order to put this in there that ranching is threatening, and then later on come back and sue and say, hey, you're not following your own EIS. To ranchers, this looks like some sort of backdoor ratchet on allotments. They're not wrong. Tonto National Forest in Arizona, there's another prime example of how conservationists have come back and sued the Forest Service saying that they're not following their grazing plans, or that they should halt grazing altogether because the Forest Service recognized that grazing is a threat. The only real threat here are the actual ranchers, because like I said, in Point Reyes, they're having to still graze the land in order to maintain it. And in Point Reyes, they made the argument that this was all about the Tule elk, preserving the Tule elk. But then they'll go into a place like Potter Valley and take down a dam and say, now we have to depopulate the Tule elk by 90%. That 90% number is not confirmed, but we have confirmed that they are depopulating the Tule elk because of their desires to take down this dam, which of course was to save the fish. But it's rather interesting because the fish required so much cool water during the summer that they had to cut off water to ranchers in order to preserve the water flow for the fish. But the natural water flow coming down the Eel River wouldn't be enough to sustain the fish at what they said they had to sustain the fish at when they cut off all the farmers and ranchers. In other words, the dam actually protects the fish. Removing the dam would not protect the fish, would depopulate the Tule elk. These guys don't care about fish, they don't care about elk. The only thing that they're doing in all of those situations is shutting down farmers and ranchers. Some would say, well, how come these conservation groups don't understand that? It's pretty hard when you're getting paid a lot of money to not understand that. I pointed out in my last video talking about California, how CalTrout, a division of Trout Unlimited, has received close to $700,000 from one of the largest shareholders of PG&E who wants to take down that dam. So they're pushing the narrative out there. They're getting paid handsomely to do it. The Nature Conservancy is getting $10 million from the state of California, just the state of California, to manage and restore the land of Point Reyes. I'm not talking about small amounts of money here. So from an outsider's perspective, it does look like there are people still within the U.S. Forest Service that are purposefully putting this wording in there. They're writing the language into these assessments in such a way that it opens the door. It is a back door for ratcheting down on family farms and ranches. Then later on, these conservation groups come in and sue, and they said, hey, look, you said it was a threat. This is how you put it in your own assessment. This is your own wording. Follow your own rules. And the courts generally will look at that assessment and rule in favor of the conservation groups.
Many of you have noticed that we keep wearing these leather patch hats that say defend the right to farm on them. These leather patch hats support our nonprofit, Meet My Neighbor Productions. You can get your hat at Yanasa Trading Co. and help us defend the right to farm through education, outreach, and, as we've been doing over the last couple of years, farm relief efforts. So get your leather patch hat and let others know that you defend the right to farm.
The relationship between the Forest Service and private ranchers should be one in which they work together, not against each other. That relationship is essential for preserving our national grasslands, but it has fallen apart dramatically over the years. Look at what happened to Charles and Heather Maude. Persecuted. They wanted to de facto orphan their children and send them to jail, bankrupt them. This is not a positive relationship between the Forest Service and private ranchers. One of the things that I do like that Brooke Rollins has done is that she did away with this conservation leasing as an acceptable use on public lands. It's not, and I would argue that it's not conservation if they're not grazing it properly. It's the ecological keystone process of maintaining grasslands. All that being said, do I necessarily think that cows are perfect surrogates for bison or the native animals that once were there? No, there's a lot of things that I think cows are missing, but I think that they're the best surrogates that we have to put in place. They're a tool that we can utilize and put into place, and they should be looked at as a tool instead of a threat. Ranchers should be looked at as a partner instead of a threat. And clearly putting this type of wording in place has caused a lot of problems for ranchers down the road. It is a backdoor system for shutting down America's ranchers.
Ancient eras and natural selection have refined and tailored pristine fibers with the resilience for today's days. Evolving beyond the last ice age, bison wool is nature's most dependable activewear. Buffalo Wool Company, 100% proven by nature, 100% American made.
Check out the Buffalo Wool Company collection at uneasetradingco.com.